Let's get the big stuff out of the way first. There was no brick. It wasn't thrown through Angela Eagle's window. The frame-up of the Wallasey Labour Party has gone on long enough. And if you're listening, Jeremy Corbyn, as I know you do from time to time, it's time to step in and support your friends and dish your enemies. There are still tens of thousands of Labour Party members disenfranchised by the utterly unrepresentative cabal clique at the heart of the Labour Party's machine, making a mockery of the two landslide victories that Jeremy Corbyn won. How many column inches have been rolled out in support of what now turns out, following a Freedom of Information request to the Merseyside police, to be a complete canard? It's time to stop witch-hunting Merseyside constituency Labour parties in support of the indefensible and the insupportable. And Jamie Oliver did not close his latest 5 closed restaurants because of Brexit. This is an untruth, and I just hope that it was his PR people who spun it and not Jamie Oliver himself. I respect him. I like him. I used to eat in one of his restaurants in Notting Hill Gate, which closed overnight long before the vote by the British people to leave the European Union. The reason, I don't know, but the stated reason I know to be false. The idea that 5 restaurants had to close because the pound is lower against the euro, thus putting up the cost of Parmesan cheese imports from Italy, is utterly preposterous. A business so dependent upon that level of profitability should have been closed anyway. And, Jamie, as I happen to know, because my wife has got a shop in Portobello, the streets of Portobello and elsewhere in London are thronged with foreign tourists and visitors, precisely because of the low level of the pound. That should translate into far more customers in your restaurants. So if you're listening, as I know that you do, Jamie, I'm asking you to call me just to argue the toss over the cost of Parmesan, because this is part and parcel of an hysteric talking down of Britain and the British economy in the wake of the Brexit vote, one which was completely unmasked by the humiliating admission by the Bank of England this very week that their Brexit predictions of economic apocalypse were completely false. They were mystic Meg moonshine. I added the moonshine, but the mystic Meg was coined by the great Simon Jenkins in The Guardian this morning. I commend the article to you. It is utter rot that we have gone into economic meltdown. In fact, the opposite is the case. Manufacturing is growing. The number of people in proper jobs is growing. The fact that the pound is low means that exports are growing, means that invisible exports, like tourism, are growing. The stock exchange, which we were told was going to plummet through the floor like the peso, in fact, is at record highs. So, there are no doubt some turbulent waters ahead as Britain leaves the European Union, but they will not be made less turbulent by people lying, I say, about the economic consequences of leaving the fading, failing, crisis-ridden Eurozone and the European Union. And the Russians are coming. Well, Donald Trump is coming, because in the last hour, the US Congress has endorsed the finding of the Electoral College, and Trump has won. It's therefore time to stop trying to exercise a coup d'etat against Trump's presidency before he even reaches the Oval Office. What's been happening in Washington in the last week is no less than that. It is the intelligence community. What a sanitized, what a euphemistic term to discuss a nest of spies and subverters and killers. The intelligence community, like the violin playing community. It's not violins that they are playing in Washington. It's a new Cold War hysteria. And, wouldn't you know it, the people who used to be against the Cold War McCarthyite hysteria are now wholly behind it. And the people that used to be for the McCarthyite Cold War hysteria are completely against it. We've got an American president who's coming to power with a mandate to improve relations with Russia and the entire political class and the quote-unquote intelligence community, and 9/10 of the mass media in the United States has gone into hysterical overdrive, causing children to be afraid to go to their bedrooms at night for fear of big, bad Boris. And I don't mean Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is our Foreign Secretary. As such, he's responsible for our Foreign Service. Now, what happened in the Foreign Service this week? A new bout of hysteria. A Whitehall knight, whose name actually escapes me. He's so unimportant. I've been enlightened, inspired by my friends. Sir Ivan Rogers. A Whitehall knight resigned from a job that nobody knew he had. None of us had ever heard of him. Insofar as he existed as our ambassador in Brussels, he manifestly had failed in his job. If you are a Remainer, he failed to persuade the EU that there was a real chance that Britain might vote to leave the EU, and that therefore their concessions to David Cameron would have to be scaled up if that decision was going to be averted. And if you're a Brexiter like me, why would you tolerate someone in full Stockholm Syndrome mode representing us in Brussels at the moment we're seeking to leave the European Union, when he has gone completely native? And yet, again, the liberal media is in hysterics about it. The man is being painted as an epic Churchillian epitome of the impartial and proper British civil servant. Now let me tell you about ambassadors, because I've known quite a few of them. An ambassador is someone sent to lie abroad for their country. That is all. Not to tell their own lies, not to try and confuse the government that sent them there, not to try and undermine the policy decisions made by their country in a referendum. 17.25 million people, the largest number of British people ever to vote for anything ever. That's not the job of an ambassador. So, I say good riddance to whoever he is, the knight who's just been shuffled. Now, there are exceptions, and one of them will be joining me very shortly indeed. Craig Murray is one of the few honourable ambassadors I have ever come across. He was sacked, you may recall, by Jack Straw, whom you may or may not remember, the very epitome of yesterday's man, since he was caught trying to get a Chinese takeaway by a Channel 4 journalist with a camera up his jumper. Jack Straw sacked Craig Murray, and I've seen the sacking letter. You have, said Jack, concentrated too much on human rights in Uzbekistan to the detriment of Britain's interests. So there you have it, the perfect dichotomy, human rights and British interests. I'll be talking to Ambassador Craig Murray about the resignation of Sir Ivan Rogers in the course of the next hour. And I'll be talking to a very distinguished economist, Vicky Price, former head of the government's Economic Council, about this humiliating admission by her fellow economists at the Bank of England that they were lying to us. Well, they didn't put it that way. They said they just forgot to factor in a whole variety of very important truths. And in the last hour, I've got a surprise package for you. I have been, as you know, and as many of you listening know very well in your cabs, I have been campaigning against the peculiar relationship of Uber and the London Mayor Office and TfL, Transport for London. It's sometimes called Totally Failing London. It is sometimes politely called instead. I've got a man coming in, Ajit Chambers, directly, hot foot from a meeting with the Prime Minister, Theresa May herself, where, right now, actually, it started at 7 o'clock, he was putting in front of her an indictment of Uber, that nexus of Uber, TfL, and the London Mayoralty, which may have extremely explosive consequences. So, assuming he's not run off the road on his way to the studio, we'll be talking to him in the last hour. So you don't want to miss any of this. Craig Murray, former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan. I wanted to talk to him about the shock resignation, shocked I was, if I'd ever heard of him before, of Sir Ivan Rogers, our man, apparently, in Brussels. Craig Murray, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George.
Now, I put it this way, Craig. An ambassador resigned from a position not many people knew he held, and the liberal media went bananas. You may have a different interpretation. If so, I'd like to hear it, please.
Yeah, well, Ivan Rogers, I didn't really know him myself. He's a Treasury man, not a Foreign Office man. And plainly he felt he wasn't sufficiently being consulted or included in the government's plans, and he couldn't work out what the government's plans were. But it is very unusual for an ambassador to resign. I think I'm the last one who did. And perhaps, it does seem to be, I think, that he is against Brexit on principle, and that seems to be his prime motivation. And I suppose you can tell he's not a Foreign Office man because he did resign on principle. People in the Foreign Office don't usually have that strong principle.
I said earlier that an ambassador is a man sent to lie abroad for his country. The problem here was that Sir Ivan was not prepared to push the country's line that we're leaving because he'd gone native. It was Stockholm Syndrome, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I think... the truth of the matter is that the large majority of senior civil servants in the UK would be against Brexit. So, and it is very difficult to carry out a policy that you fundamentally disagree with. So it's not surprising in that sense.
Well, if you don't mind my saying so, I know you're not amongst them. It now turns out, according to Chilcot, that a very large number of your former colleagues at the Foreign Office thought that the Blair policy of taking us to war with Iraq was, to quote you, bollocks. But they faithfully enough carried it out.
That's very true. And as I say, Foreign Office people tend to be less bothered by principle. And there's also kind of golden handcuffs that keep you in the Foreign Office. Everyone in the Foreign Office, more or less, has their children at incredibly expensive private boarding schools paid for by the British taxpayer, and that in itself is a perk that if you've got several children is worth hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. So people from the Foreign Office very seldom actually resign.
This is one of our problems, isn't it? We have a mandarinate, we have a political class, we have a finance capital class, we have big business in general. All of them are against the decision of the British people to leave the EU, and they're entitled to be against it, of course, but not if they are setting traps and booby traps and landmines to try and fight a rearguard action to frustrate the decision of the British people.
Well, I think that almost certainly will be happening. I should say I'm quite in favour of the EU myself. I view it as a part of internationalism, if you like. I come at it from that perspective. But no, certainly people ought to be doing their job and getting on and carrying out the policy. But to be fair, part of the problem is that it's not at all plain what the policy is. And the people you've got, the ministers you've got in government, particularly Liam Fox and Theresa May, just don't have the intellectual ability to really work out all the ramifications of this. On top of which...
I'm with you on that. But Craig, let me turn to another matter, if I may. This week saw the return to the field of your friend and mine, Tony Blair, with a £10 million war chest of his own money, he says, having discontinued his private business, he says. And this is not going to be a think tank. It's going to be an organ of engagement, by which he means controversy and political activity, explicitly trying to reverse the Brexit decision. That'll pose some difficulties for very upstanding fellows like you who are for the EU, and now with £10 million in his pocket, Tony Blair has taken the field, as it were, on that side of the argument.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't take part in the referendum campaign at all, on the grounds that I just couldn't bring myself to be arguing on the same side as Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson and various people.
Quite so, yes.
Various people like that. And my own view is that the reason we are leaving the EU is that the EU became identified with a political establishment which is hated. And there's nobody in the political establishment who is more hated than Tony Blair. And of course he has amazing media access. The Guardian fawns on his every word, and he'll be able to get his message pushed out. But there's no doubt at all that the public view him as a terrible disaster, a man who brought disaster to the Middle East and brought really international crisis and caused the rise of ISIS or all these other things which we're seeing, all a result of his appalling judgment and his desire to make money. So it won't get anywhere. It won't affect public opinion anyway. And if anything, Tony Blair will just make people even more against the European Union than they already were. But the main problem of the European Union is that its defence came from a political establishment which is detested.
Craig Murray, Ambassador, I appreciate you coming on the show. I see you almost every night, actually, on my film, The Killings of Tony Blair. So I never tire looking at you, let me say. Craig, thank you very much for joining us. Craig Murray from Edinburgh, where he now is ensconced, former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan. Now another day, another act of mass murder, this time in sunny Florida in the United States. An ongoing situation. What we know so far is that a shooter is in police custody and a significant number of people have been shot, and I believe some of them dead. Let's talk with Erica Rodriguez from 610 WIOD News Radio in Florida. Erica, thanks for joining us at such short notice. What can you tell us about the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting?
Well, right at this moment, we just got word about 5 minutes ago from the police agency working this scene that 13 people have in fact been shot, 5 of them had died. 8 have been taken to the airport at this time. And we do see people running off the tarmacs at the airport, and we do have police, the SWAT team, running toward an actual garage at the airport. Why? We are not sure yet. Nobody is saying much. However, this obviously is a massive scene right now and a major problem. We cannot make any kind of inference on what happened, why somebody did this, but there is word that one person is, in fact, in custody.
Yes, so are they looking for anyone else, or is their assumption that there was one shooter and that shooter is now in custody?
We are not sure. In fact, as I mentioned, that we do have the sheriff's office saying that they have people running toward that area, so nobody is having time to come out and brief the media on what exactly the situation is, if there is another suspect out there, but people are running through the airport and off the airport, so there's definite heightened security and scares at this time.
Now, do you happen to know which part of I know that airport quite well, which part of the airport this happened in? Was it in the airside, or was it in the front part of the airport? And what weapon was used?
We don't know what type of weapon was used, but we do know that this is all happening at Terminal 2 in the baggage claim area. So that is an area that is not where you have to go through security. Now, what a motive is, who did it, why, what they used, we don't have that information at this time.
Erica, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. A state of some confusion there. Erica Rodriguez of 610 WIOD News Radio in Florida. We'll keep you updated, of course, with that dreadful story as it developed. I'm looking at pictures of it now. It has always struck me as odd that in some airports, many airports in the US, the baggage claim area is not airside. In most British airports, it is airside and therefore secure. But in many airports, especially in the US, and that one in Fort Lauderdale I happen to know quite well, is an airport where the baggage claim area is outside. So, on with the show. We talked with Craig Murray about the brouhaha, I think an entirely confected one, in the media, the liberal media, because that's what we're talking about here, a neoliberal elite that has refused to come to terms with the fact that their expertise was rejected by the British people, 17.25 million of them, on the question of whether Britain was to leave the EU. And it's clear enough to me that the ambassador we had in Brussels, at the very least, had not done a good enough job of persuading the EU of the determination amongst millions of British people to leave the EU. And he saw his boss, David Cameron, return from the negotiations prior to the referendum virtually empty-handed, and then ritually humiliated and defenestrated. That was a point at which I would have thought a man of principle would have actually resigned, rather than clinging on to his post when it was clear that, to say the least, his heart was not in the policy that the country had determined upon. His cause was not helped by Jonathan Powell taking to the airwaves on BBC Radio, defending him as a paragon of civil service virtue. Not least because, as Peter Oborne pointed out ferociously and forensically in the Daily Mail this week, actually Jonathan Powell and Alastair Campbell and Tony Blair, the cabal at the heart of Downing Street with Peter Manderson, had done more to destroy the impartiality of the British civil service than any group of men in history. Jonathan Powell, who for 10 years was Tony Blair's right-hand man, and is his right-hand man still. He was the head honcho at Tony Blair Associates. I don't know the status of Tony Blair Associates now that the great man has decided that he's turning back from the grubby pursuit of £100 million and more to return to British public life. His stated objective with £10 million from him as an initial budget is to reverse Brexit. Now, as Craig Murray just pointed out, I can't think of anyone more likely to turn people against the Remainer cause than Tony Blair. But it seems that he is being welcomed with open arms by this liberal media that's been in overdrive over Sir Ivan's resignation as our man in Brussels. Tell me what you think about the return of Tony Blair to the field. You can email us, as someone has, Lange Bog. He sent a message saying, "Good evening, George. So Tony Blair is dipping into his war chest and pulling out £10 million. No doubt he earned off the backs of the 1 million dead Iraqis to launch, in my opinion, a civil war against the 52.8% who dared to upset the political establishment by voting for Brexit." Indeed, indeed. And here's another one from Pedro. "George, do you see what I see? The political and media establishment in this country and the USA seem to be sensing they are losing their power to the ordinary man and woman on the street with the election of Trump and the Brexit victory. And boy, they don't like it one bit. They don't like it up them, Pedro. But hey, they're going to have to get used to it." Mark on Twitter says, "And real Donald Trump will be a president who will start wars in the South China Sea." Well, there's a definite danger of that. There's a peculiar dichotomy in Trump's foreign policy of wishing to be bosom buddies with Vladimir Putin and Russia, whilst wishing to confront China, and for that matter, Iran. But I suspect he's going to learn that these are three allies that cannot be separated, and that to be friends with one, you will have to at least not be an enemy of the others. But we'll see. Ragnar Fernandez says, "Hide your kids, hide your wife. The Russians are coming. I know because the trustworthy and reputable CIA told us." Brilliant, Ragnar, and that's the point I've been trying to make all week, actually. And I made it last week, you'll recall, to my friend John Le Boutillier on air, and he didn't really have an answer. The United States has interfered in everybody's elections for all of my life and longer. And not only interfered in their elections, but rigged elections, invaded countries, quarantined them, blockaded them, embargoed them in order to change their regimes. An entire military, industrial, intelligence community industry has been built in the US precisely to affect the outcome of other people's elections. Now, as I told you last week, I have the benefit of knowing that the material that WikiLeaks published on the Democrat National Committee was not a hack at all. It was a leak. And it didn't come from Russia. It came from someone inside the Democratic Party hierarchy, angry, I presume, at the hijacking of the Democratic Party's nomination for Hillary Clinton, and the skullduggery with which they dispatched the only man in the Democratic Party who could have beaten Trump hands down, namely Senator Bernie Sanders. Make of that what you will. Now, if you're thinking, well, what evidence are you giving me, Mr. Galloway, for that? My answer is precisely the same evidence that the CIA and the FBI are giving you for the opposite, an assertion. Now, you can believe me, or you can believe the CIA. You'd be a fool to do the latter. We're talking Trump, talking Brexit, talking Russians with snow on their boots, talking Jamie Oliver, and later we'll be talking about the Bank of England and their Mystic Meg moonshine predictions of a train crash on Brexit, which turned out to be so humiliatingly wrong that the B of E had to take to the airwaves and issue a humiliating apology. And a surprise package coming at the end of the show. A man hot foot from a meeting with the Prime Minister, Theresa May, about Uber, about the black taxi cab in London, about TFL. Asif is on the line from Surrey on Brexit, and Jamie Oliver. Asif, welcome.
Hi, George. I just wanted to say that Jamie Oliver's pronouncements that closing 5 restaurants because of Brexit just doesn't add up. If the only effect of Brexit so far, because Article 50 hasn't been a vote, is the currency exchange rate between the euro and the pound.
Yep.
And, there are many ingredients you can buy from many places, including all of Britain. And
even Parmesan cheese, I'm told. So the idea that he's had to close 5 restaurants because of the higher cost of imports from Italy, of course, first of all, contradicts his repeated assertion that he sources as much as possible, as locally as possible, but of course would be more than balanced by the number of tourists and visitors coming to London precisely because of the low price of the pound.
Exactly. And, menus at any restaurant, you eat out a lot, you tweet regularly. Menus are always being revised because of seasonal food, seasonal produce becoming available. And Italy is not very different climatically from Britain. So it just doesn't add up. And
the truth is, Asif, he opened too many restaurants. He cheapened the brand. Everywhere you look, there's a Jamie's this and a Jamie's that. And he can't possibly be cooking in them all. He can't possibly be properly managing them all. You put your name on a brand, you let it spin out of control. Result, misery.
Exactly. And, I'd respect him a lot more and his business a lot more. I respect him as you do, but I respect his business a lot more if they just said the truth. Just said what you just said. They expanded too quickly. They spread themselves too thin. They're closing down the unprofitable ones. That's how refreshing would it be to hear the truth?
Exactly, and he's always had a name for telling the truth, even when people didn't want to hear it. He was telling mothers that pushing hamburgers through the school fence to their kids rather than having a healthy school dinner was bad news. He made a career out of being a man that told the truth. That's why I'm so angry about it. I used to eat every week in one of his restaurants in Notting Hill Gate, and it closed literally overnight, leaving a big and now ugly piece of real estate in a prime place in central London. And it wasn't to do with Brexit. It was long before the vote on the referendum.
No, it's probably more to do with the fact that, his show is not on Channel 4 as often as it used to be, or whatever it may be.
But this is part, Asif, so as not to concentrate over much on him, this is part of a scaremongering tactic to persuade the British people that they voted the wrong way in the referendum and soften them up for a demand for a second referendum.
Yes, I'm a Remainer, and I agree with your argument, though. It's a disingenuous argument, and, all of this is nothing to do with Brexit. And it is all corporate shenanigans, let alone political shenanigans. Whichever way the Brexit vote would have taken, corporations would have tried to take advantage of it one way or the other and blamed the vote for it. So it's disingenuous and it's scaremongering. And I don't think it's very clever. A bit of honesty from Jamie Oliver's business would be nice to hear. And in terms of Theresa May and the government's position, we've only heard one soundbite, which was horrendous. The red, white, and blue Brexit is what she's after. Yes. She's not put any flesh on the bones. There's been no debate. As you said, Jeremy Corbyn's been shut down at Prime Minister's questions. There's almost been a blackout when he raises these things. So, it's not Jamie Oliver we should be looking at. It's at Maggie May, as you said.
Asif, you're a clever man. Don't be a stranger. That was a very good call from Asif in Surrey. Meanwhile, lots of people are tweeting. Jay says, people, media, and the intelligence community in America are in hysteria because Trump is the embodiment of I've not got the second half of that tweet. You'll have to wait for that. But hysteria is exactly what it is. Now, I repeat for those who weren't around, I'm not happy that Donald Trump is to be the President of the United States. But I'm very, very happy that Hillary Clinton is not. And give the man a chance, he's not even in yet. And if the thing that's creating the hysteria is that he wants peace rather than war with Russia, well, there's only one side I can be on in that argument. Where do you stand? And we've got an SMS from Tad. Evening, George. We have effectively been allowed to devalue the pound, much to our advantage. If Greece could quit the euro, they might also dig themselves out of the mighty hole, the banksters, the irresponsible politicians, the Germans, and all those who got Greece into the euro under a false pretext. And that's actually what it was. Now, here's a statement issued, I presume, not just to me, but my clever young man through the glass has brought it in. It's just in. It's a statement from President-elect Donald J. Trump. Draw up your chairs in your drawing room. New York, New York. President-elect Donald J. Trump released the following statement at the conclusion of the meeting with intelligence community leaders. Quote, I had a constructive meeting and conversation with the leaders of the intelligence community this afternoon. I have tremendous respect for the work and service done by the men and women of this community to our great nation. While Russia, China, other countries, outside groups, and people are consistently trying to break through the cyber infrastructure of our governmental institutions, businesses and organizations, including the Democrat National Committee, there was absolutely no effect on the outcome of the election, including the fact that there was no tampering whatsoever with voting machines. There were attempts to hack the Republican National Committee, but the RNC has strong hacking defenses, and the hackers were unsuccessful. He continues, whether it is our government, organizations, associations, or businesses, we need to aggressively combat and stop cyber attacks. I will appoint a team to give me a plan within 90 days of taking office. The methods, tools, and tactics we use to keep America safe should not be a public discussion that will benefit those who seek to do us harm. 2 weeks from today, he says, I will take the oath of office, and America's safety and security will be my number one priority. So not backing down, I think you can say. Donald Trump robustly facing up to the quote-unquote intelligence community, which in the last few days has become the euphemism for a nest of spies, subverters, coup makers, invaders, and killers. But hey, if you call something a community, isn't it very, very much nicer? Here's another text, anonymous, I'm afraid. I'm scared that the Tories will repeal all the good EU laws after Brexit. They were all that protected a lot of us from the so-called austerity agenda. What are you talking about? Just as well you're anonymous. Who protected us from the austerity agenda? We have been shivering throughout the last 8 years, 9 years now, in the austerity agenda. The austerity agenda is even more devastating in the rest of the European Union. Half of the young people in Spain are unemployed. Half of the young people in Portugal are unemployed. Half of the children in Greece are malnourished. What are you talking about? The EU protecting us from the austerity agenda. And what are these good EU laws that the Tories might repeal? And there's a big, big difference, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. We can vote the Tories out. We can scrap the Tory austerity if we persuade the British people to vote for something different. We cannot vote out those who run the austerity project in the EU. We are bound by law to succumb and subjugate ourselves to it. Have some confidence in yourself. Have some confidence in the British people. We can build a country fit to be a decent, civilized society if we can persuade our people so to do. Just as well you're anonymous. Hello, George, says a texter. There is nothing new, as the great Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius said. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. That's very, very profound. I didn't know that His Honour Marcus Aurelius had said that, but I'll be saying it from now on. Ford says if the USA never interfered in so many countries, the world would be very peaceful and very different. Listen, I have a friend whose father was in the presidential palace in Santiago, in Chile, when the Chilean armed forces burst through the door and murdered their president in a coup being organized from the war room of the White House in Washington. And these people want to talk about foreigners interfering in their elections? I don't know whether to laugh or cry. One more, Mark Golding, Children of Iraq Association. It was Washington that drove European integration in the late 1940s, and Washington that funded it covertly under Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and the Johnson and Nixon administrations. I believe the war criminal Blair has been tasked by the US intelligence community to muddy the waters. Well, only if you let him. Nothing is cast in stone. If you are stupid enough to listen to Tony Blair tell you what he says is the truth, then frankly you deserve everything that you are going to get. This is the mother of all talk shows. I'm George Galloway. This is Talk Radio 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call to join the great debate. Well, 5 people have been shot dead and many, many others wounded in a mass shooting in Fort Lauderdale Airport in Florida, an airport I know well. It was the 6th mass shooting in the United States in the last 6 days. I tell you, this is a country in deep crisis. Its divisions between rich and poor, between different races, between different parts of the country are so profound that it's going to take the wisdom of Solomon to put the country back together again. It's going to take focus and attention to America's problems by the American government, meaning I hope that they'll pay less attention to ours. Now, we've got an eyewitness to the mass shooting in which at least 5 are dead. Let's hear him.
As I got my first bag off, I heard the first shot, and as I did, the person right next to me fell to the ground.
Well, it must be truly horrific to be caught up in these kind of things. I myself have been under fire more than once. I can tell you that you literally wish that the ground would open up and swallow you so that you can avoid the hot, razor-sharp steel that is whizzing and spinning around you. Maybe I'll talk about that depending on how many people want to call up the show. But first I want to talk to an expert, a real one, Professor Inderjeet Parmar, whom I've spoken with several times before on television and on radio, because I want to get a sense in which all the tables seem to be turning in the US. As I said in my opening remarks, a kind of Cold War, anti-Russian, McCarthyite hysteria has broken out amongst precisely the people that used to resist right-wing attempts to create just that kind of atmosphere. Whilst on the other side, those that used to create those scares, Russian Reds under the bed scares, are the people who, objectively, whether they like it or not, are now being caricatured as people who won because of the Reds, because of the Russians. It's a funny old world, as Margaret Thatcher once opined. Let's hear from Professor Inderjeet, who is calling us now from Watford. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice to speak to you again.
It's a very odd moment, isn't it? We've got Democrats and people on the left of American politics talking in very reverential terms about the intelligence community, an intelligence community that they used to excoriate and whose target the intelligence community used to have them. How do you square it all off, Professor?
Well, it is interesting, as you say. It is the kind of the usual alignment has to some extent been reversed, although I think we have to remember that effectively the Cold War was actually kicked off by the Democrats, President Harry Truman, back in the late 1940s. So the kind of anti-red hysteria, in a way, began in earnest with the Democrat in office, and to somewhat on the kind of further to the left than Democratic presidents Clinton and Obama have been. So I think the anti-communist or sort of anti-Russian idea of a threat was right across the system even then. But it is unusual to have it played this way. But what it suggests is that the groups of people in power, and particularly when they faced a defeat of the type that they have in the November elections, they're seeking to try to explain it. And I think what they're trying to really do is to avoid really any kind of introspection about what it is that they stand for and what program they offered to the American electorate overall. And it was one which was not for change, which was what most people wanted. So I think they are, rather than introspecting, for example, when the DNC's emails were leaked, that suggested that there was a degree of sabotage going on with the Sanders campaign and other things as well. And instead of really recognizing that this is what they were doing, they wanted to put a spotlight on where did these things come from, rather than looking at the accuracy. They haven't actually challenged the accuracy of most of these leaked emails and so on.
Well, that's a very good point. Let me press you on that point first, Professor. No one is claiming that what WikiLeaks published was in any way untrue.
Right.
And it's very difficult to imagine liberals being infuriated by truths being published. That's usually the job of the right.
Yes. But I think, as you will probably know, in America there isn't really much of a left. It's mainly right and extreme right. And so what I think being used as tactics are the kind of traditional tactics of the right. But they happen to be directed at a new president-elect who has expressed some reticence to continue a generally aggressive policy in regard to Russia, and some admiration for the Russian leader, President Putin. And I think, in a way, it's probably an attempt in various ways to try to stem that in some form, make it more difficult. And the other thing, of course, is that it's not just Democrats. Senator John McCain and many other Republican senators and congressmen are also calling for inquiries on that sort of front. So it's a bit more than that. And I think, to some extent, it suggests that elements of the establishment, which have always stood in the right and the left, or so-called left, Democratic Party, are unifying against somebody who threatens the possibility of change, whether it actually ever would happen or not, but the possibility of a major shift in policy towards Russia, especially given what's happened since the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the general expansion eastward of NATO.
Exactly, and you and I watched the American elections together overnight in a TV studio, I quickly add, and we saw it unfold. We saw the so-called Rust Belt where deindustrialization, devastation, is the order of the day under the very neoliberal economic policies championed initially by President Bill Clinton.
Yes.
And we saw those states turning for the Republican nominee. And this consensus of the establishment that you correctly identify, this is precisely why Trump won, isn't it? Because nobody loves that establishment anymore.
Well, that's it. Hillary Clinton stood for that establishment at a time when her main opponents were opponents of the establishment, both within the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, with Donald Trump. And quite frankly, didn't put forward a vision for people who were feeling outside and excluded. And many of those people had voted for Barack Obama, actually, just 4 years earlier.
Indeed. Millions. She lost millions of his votes.
Was laid by the failures of the two administrations of Barack Obama as well. And his endorsement of Hillary, a sort of queen or empress in waiting, was just really the kind of kiss of death as well.
I agree.
Had Hillary not seen, I mean, as you know, the John Podesta emails showed that the Clinton campaign identified Donald Trump as their ideal opponent. And they therefore saw Bernie Sanders as their principal roadblock to their ambition of the White House. And they got it completely and utterly wrong from their own point of view. If they had identified that, look, there's somebody in the Democratic fold who actually is offering a program which is enthusing large numbers of young people, large proportions of young people and women voters and so on, and you have some sort of an alliance, a joint ticket, you would have stood a far better chance of winning the White House. But as it was, they bigged up Donald Trump in order to give him much more publicity and credibility as an opponent, on the hope that people would say that he's so right-wing that they will never vote for him, they therefore come to Hillary Clinton. And it just backfired completely. And a lot of the Sanders supporters and others who were not enthused, but who normally vote Democratic, just stayed home. And that's part of the big reason why Hillary Clinton lost and the Democrats lost out.
And if you are guilty of a miscalculation that gigantic, and you've spent $1.25 billion on your election campaign, you could see why the Democrats are looking around for someone else to blame.
Yeah, well, it's easy to turn around and blame somebody else, but the key issue is, in the end, you have to confront what you did yourself. And I'm afraid Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that after the convention in July, with a few points from Bernie Sanders' program in the platform, saying that this was the most progressive platform in the history of the Democratic Party or whatever, actually then completely and utterly forgot about all the promises which were made about Wall Street and reforms and that kind of thing, and never mentioned them again. And I don't think she even mentioned them. I mean, I listened to all three of the debates live. I don't seem to recall any mention of a progressive platform. It was all about identity. It was about diversity and identity, and an attempt to show up Donald Trump's misogynistic and racialized kinds of tone. But in terms of a program for workers, black or white workers or whatever, poor people, there wasn't anything promised there. It was all about Trump saying that America's broken. We say America works. And the fact is that large numbers of people, particularly since the financial crash of 2007-8, do not believe that America is a place which works for them. There's large numbers of people who are very discontented and anxious about their economic and financial futures. And Trump was the one candidate who, in the actual presidential election, who focused on that and actually created the sort of demand, sated the demand for that, from that sort of quarter.
I mean, Sanders should have been the candidate. All the polls show that. But even if he was not to be, Professor, if she had made Sanders her running mate and sent him into the places in the Rust Belt as the putative vice president of the United States, she'd have won in a canter.
But I think certainly would. I think she would have won. I think she would have won those key states. because there would be somebody who was going to rail against the establishment and talk about the creation of jobs, the building of infrastructure, and a kind of better health care and the abolition of tuition fees and so on. Yeah, that was a genuinely sort of progressive program and a platform. And that coalition between the left of the Democratic Party and of the sort of main part of the Democratic Party, I think that would have been probably would have been a winning coalition.
What happens next, Professor? I mean, she has said that she might run again in 2020. I think that's not credible. But does the Democratic Party now turn towards the Sanders view of the world, or does it stick with the prevailing orthodoxy?
Well, I think they're going to find it in practice very difficult just to stick with the prevailing orthodoxy. That might serve them a little bit in terms of criticizing Donald Trump and anything where he steps beyond the sort of accepted consensus broadly established in the last 20 years. But in the end, that's not going to be a winning strategy for an election. And I would think that Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has a very strong reputation, is on the left and the progressive element in the Democratic Party. I think she and Bernie Sanders and like-minded senators and congresspeople, I think they've got the opportunity now to really build a broader program, which will be sort of building on the Sanders program. And I think, as you may know, that Sanders has set up 2 or 3 institutions, which began actually back in the spring, which are, one of them is ideological, to look at the sources of inequality of power, wealth, and distribution, and so on. Another one is called Brand New Congress, which is aiming to stand 400 candidates in the 2018 midterm congressional elections. And another group called Our Revolution, which is kind of trying to bring out people and stand for school boards and local government positions and so on. And it's really trying to build a grassroots and national level movement to have a different kind of politics, what he calls a post-partisan politics. So he's looking for people who might have supported the Tea Party in the past or Occupy Wall Street in the past, but who've never held political office, and who are considered by their communities to be people who work for the community and not themselves.
Professor, as always, you've been enormously helpful. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Inderjeet Parmar, a very clever man who's helped us through many a discussion of American politics. Now, just to show you how crazed things are becoming in the United States, 2 of America's biggest celebrities turned politicians have been having a spat on Twitter about TV ratings. Donald Trump's been mocking Arnold Schwarzenegger over audience figures for The Apprentice, which have dropped since the actor took over presenting. The Terminator star responded by tweeting, "The president-elect should work for all American people as aggressively as he did for his show's ratings." I don't know why someone doesn't take Donald Trump's phone away from him. I mean, has he not got a wife or a daughter that can say, "Listen, Dad, give me that phone, because you're going to plunge us into some terrible troubles by this lax habit of tweeting the first thing that comes into your mind." But it's not just on that side. I just read that Oprah Winfrey is going to run for president in 2020, presumably looking for the Democratic nomination, being the first black woman to run for the presidency. Now, it's been many a year since I saw Oprah, but she's a very likeable person, no doubt, much more likeable than Hillary Clinton. But what credentials exactly does she have to be President of the United States? Oh, wait. It's Donald Trump up next. Here's John in Hamilton on these matters. Go ahead, John.
Hi, George. Nice to talk to you again.
And you.
I've just fallen off my chair there at the thought of President Oprah Winfrey. But then, I suppose...
Donald Trump versus Oprah Winfrey for the presidency of the United States. The main lesson here, John, is let's stop looking to America as our father, as our leader. Let them do what they want, and let us do what we want.
I mean, I'm quite happy to stand back and just watch and see what Donald Trump does or doesn't do and judge him on that. And But just on that, I'm quite happy that he also said that he cast doubt in the intelligence services a couple of days ago and what
intelligence community, John. We've got to get the terms right. The community.
Okay. Just on that Russian supposed alleged interference, I heard you last week. I think it was when John Lopatelli was on.
Yeah.
And I've great respect for John. I like him, and I don't always agree with what he says, but I thought your gentle dismantling of his argument was a masterclass in how to.
I tried to do it without falling out with him.
Yeah. I think you managed it. Managed it. And I'm thinking back, George. I mean, time goes very quickly now. But 8 years ago, just before Barack Obama took office, there was such a hope in the world, really, that things were going to be different and things were going to be better, and that Barack Obama was going to instigate all these changes.
John, small kids were going to school chanting his name in Scottish towns the morning after his victory. That's how high the hopes were.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everyone would agree it's been a betrayal of all that hope. But I just want to know your opinion. I mean, I've heard different people give an estimation and analysis of what he's done, and some have said he was just simply a PR man with no substance. Others have said that he was a good man with good intentions, but he was thwarted by just the Republicans at every turn. What is your overall assessment? How do you think history will judge him?
Well, he's let everyone down. He's let black people down. The number of black people gunned down on the streets of America under his watch has been at record numbers. It's been a lynching, an extrajudicial lynching in towns and cities throughout America almost every day of the week. And the racial polarization in America has never looked more dangerous to me.
Yeah.
He let the working class down. He came into power when Wall Street was on its knees, when American capitalism was on its knees, instead of insisting upon, to use Roosevelt's term, a New Deal. He picked them up and stuffed their pockets full of hundreds of billions of dollars and put them right back on top. He let the world down. He got a Nobel Peace Prize before he even started the gig. And in fact, he's been at war every day. He said he'd close Guantanamo Bay. He's expanded it, and so on. Go on, John.
But is that though because he had no alternative, or were his hands tied? That's what I can't get. Did he have the option, and could he have forced these things through if he'd wanted, or were the votes just against him in the House?
The presidency is above all a pulpit, and he was ideally placed. You see, let me put it this way. If I was in this position, by the way, this also applies to my earlier remarks about Jeremy Corbyn. You see, Jeremy Corbyn cannot force the National Executive to readmit people that have been expelled and suspended and so on. He cannot force the withdrawal of the suspension of the Wallasey Labour Party and so on. But what he could do is make it clear where he stands on these issues.
Yeah.
He could be on the pulpit talking about them all the time and enforcing moral pressure on those who do have the power. So on some things, Obama did have the power and didn't use it. On other things, he didn't have the power, but he never tried.
Right.
And so that's why I find it impossible to forgive him. He had a great opportunity, a landslide victory, great public support. He had the United States embroiled in unwinnable wars that had cost them thousands of lives and hundreds of billions of dollars, and he found Wall Street on its knees. And instead of using that opportunity to completely change things, as Roosevelt had done from 1935, he blew it. And so no amount of tears from his wife tonight, who, I mean, seems to be a lovely person. She's asking you to view his presidency through rose-tinted glasses. That is just impossible for me.
Yeah, I suppose when I heard John Kerry's speech a couple of weeks ago, I just thought, on the Middle East I'm talking about, when he spoke about Israel and what they had done and what they should have done and what they shouldn't be doing, I thought, how much better would it have been if he'd said that in the first month of the 8 years rather than the last month of the 8 years.
Well, Obama gave record amounts of military and financial aid to the very Israel that his Secretary of State was traducing in his final speech.
Yeah.
And Obama laid out in his landmark speech in Cairo, in the first months of his presidency, the whole picture. And he was exactly right. But he has done absolutely nothing about it. Now, here's what I don't understand. When you're a first-term president, you've got to fear the pro-Israel lobby, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They're very ferocious and powerful people. But when you're in your second term, and you're never going to run for election again, why are you still afraid of them?
Yeah.
That's what I'll never understand. So my conclusion, John, is that he was a coward.
Right.
That Obama his legacy will be that his 8 years were marked above all by cowardice. And that's not a very good look.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks very much, George.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk to John in Hamilton. The good news is that Oprah has said she has no interest in the presidency. She's listening to the show, no doubt. Although I read yesterday that she is giving it serious consideration. It would be an absurdity. It would be a further doubling down of identity politics, would it not? That's the good news. Oprah says she's not interested. The bad news is Jerry Lewis. No, is he still around, Jerry Lewis? I mean, think of somebody ridiculous, and I'll come back. Let's think of some ridiculous personalities that could run for the US presidency next. Well, if Donald Trump can do it. Now, I want to talk to another expert, but this time a real one. Vicky Price is a distinguished economist, former head of the Government Economic Service, and I want to talk to her about the rather humiliating event yesterday, I think it was, when the Bank of England had to confess that its predictions of the economic outcomes of Brexit were, well, to put it kindly, Mystic Meg moonshine. Vicky Price is no Mystic Meg. She knows a thing or two, and I'm glad to say she joins us now. Vicky, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
What do you make of the fact that people in such powerful positions, you must have read Simon Jenkins, a fellow economist of yours today, excoriating the way in which what is supposed to be a science, albeit the dismal science, in fact, it's just another branch of politics and public relations.
Oh, well, I don't agree with that at all. I think, of course, economists make predictions which don't always come to pass, because, of course, we deal with a lot of uncertainty all the time. But to assume that everything that has been coming out, particularly in relation to Brexit and the period before the referendum vote, was political, is hugely exaggerating anything that was going on before. It's true, of course, that we had a very powerful Chancellor, and David Cameron as Prime Minister really wanted to win the referendum. But nevertheless, what the economists were producing was very much what the models were telling them, which they had learned from previous experience would be the outcome if we were voting to leave the EU. But of course, I think Andrew Haldane yesterday was talking much more about the financial crisis back in 2008 and how the economists had failed to do that and to predict that. And it is true that a number of us did fail to predict that, but we were quite convinced that a lot of things need to happen after the shock of that crisis to make it right again. And I think we learned a lot from that, and we've been learning from all that ever since in terms of how we're dealing with this crisis, which I think is absolutely the right way in terms of liquidity into the banking system, lowering interest rates and so on that the Bank of England has actually undertaken since, which I think has stabilised confidence very significantly.
Well, you say you're learning, but the Queen, who famously, if you saw The Crown on Netflix, didn't have an education at all, she asked the bull question at the London School of Economics in 2008, why did nobody see this coming? And yet, we have a set of predictions, apologised for yesterday, about the outcome of the Brexit vote, which turned out actually to be out of the same school, didn't it?
In fact, the predictions that were made, even at the time of the financial crisis by a number of economists, were spot on in the sense that many were already warning about this, but it was generally ignored. People didn't want to listen to this at all. And what's been happening on the Brexit side is that one of the forecasts that was made, which has been proven absolutely right, is that the pound was going to fall very significantly, which it has done. What, of course, you can't predict is what the political response would be, or the policy response, rather. And the Bank of England intervened very, very significantly, immediately, to ease the concerns that everyone had about a possible financial meltdown that may be happening if nothing was done, and to ensure that markets returned to some normality. And I think that's what we've learned. We've learned how to deal with shocks, which normally you can't incorporate into your forecast.
Yes, but if you then go out and give a net version of events which excludes the things that the government is going to do, then you're going to get it wrong. I mean, you're putting up a sterling, if you'll forgive the pun, defence of your profession. But Simon Jenkins, not just one of our finest writers, but himself an economist, says today in The Guardian, economists have completely failed us. They're no better than Mystic Meg. And Andy himself says that it was a Michael Fish moment, a reference, of course, to there will be no hurricane back in the evening before there was indeed a hurricane.
Yes, I heard all that, and I've read everything that's been said about this. But first of all, of course, we're talking about the 2008 financial crisis, and that's what he was referring to rather than Brexit. And as I said before, it's not true that nobody had foreseen it or was warning about this. And of course, what has been happening is that the world is globalized. There's huge interconnectivity. The models, I have to admit, have not necessarily incorporated some of that into them. And now, of course, that is happening. But as far as Brexit is concerned, I think a number of people were worried that having missed the previous drop in confidence, they may have been missing it again if there was a similar shock. And I think they were probably more pessimistic than has proved to be the case. But it's worth remembering, first of all, that the pound has stayed low, and very low. I mean, dropped very significantly. And it does suggest that the markets agreed with what the economists were saying, basically that the economy was not going to grow as fast as it would have done otherwise if we leave the EU.
Why is the FTSE, Vicky, why is the FTSE at an all-time high then?
Oh, well, a number of reasons. The main one has been that the low value of the pound has led to a substantial improvement in the profits of firms that make most of their money out of overseas operations. So if you look at the FTSE 100, 80% of their revenues come from abroad. So if you translate that back into pounds, then it makes for a much, much better picture for them. If you look at what's happened in terms of, let's say, in dollars, so if you look at the FTSE and look at it in dollar terms, there's actually been a decline over the year, about 4%, I think. And if you look at it in terms of euros, there's been no change at all since a year ago. So
well, luckily we deal in pounds, and the prediction was that the FTSE was going to fall through the floor, and moreover that the fall in the value of the pound would be a bad thing rather than, as it's turning out so far, to be a good thing on balance. And you can argue, as I think you are, that these are technical issues, but I put to you a further point that Simon Jenkins made. He says that these predictions were the equivalent of the dodgy dossier of the intelligence community on Iraq's supposed weapons arsenal. In other words, a politicized, deliberately deceptive set of political points masquerading as science and factual prediction.
Well, I don't agree with any of that, I have to admit. Of course, it was a very politicized atmosphere just before the referendum debate. People could interpret whatever was coming out in all sorts of different ways. If you look at the warnings that were given by the Treasury, for example, and the Bank of England, it was that in the medium to long term, there was a range of options in terms of where GDP would be going. So those were from very small changes to quite significant ones. And the middle point was used by the Chancellor when they came out and said that there would be a £4,500 loss per household as a result of this. But the fact that the medium term is actually worrying, all you need to do is just look at the forecast of the Office for Budget Responsibility. Independent, acts for the Chancellor, of course, but independent alongside the autumn statement. And what they've already said is that the cost to the economy, just in terms of borrowing, of Brexit between now and the end of this Parliament is nearly £60 billion. That is something that we will have to pay for over a period of time. So in other words, we've increased our deficit to GDP ratio, we've increased our debt to GDP ratio because of Brexit. So you can't ignore all these issues which are all around, if you like, the sort of economic sphere, and say just because the economy is doing reasonably well, because of course interest rates are low and everyone is borrowing a lot of money, then the forecasts were wrong.
Well, interest rates are low. The low pound is working to our benefit. The FTSE is at an all-time high. Manufacturing is up. Jobs are up. Full-time jobs are up. You can see why people lose faith in experts, if I can put it that way.
Well, they may do, but let's see why this is happening. First of all, as I said before, we haven't left the EU. Second, with the pound being down, the pound perhaps would not have been as low as it is if we hadn't cut interest rates even further, which is exactly what the Bank of England did. And people would not be borrowing as much if there wasn't this huge increase in liquidity, and relaxation in the capital requirements of banks for next year, which of course meant that one could borrow an awful lot more, and the banks were forced to go out there and lend. So you wouldn't have the consumer enjoying this huge increase in their ability to borrow and spend. So you wouldn't have had that. But what you have got is that inflation is creeping up. And the real worry is because of the increased cost to manufacturers of imported components and increased cost to consumers of anything that's being sold in the shops, you will end up with the consumers themselves actually having either zero or fall in terms of their real disposable incomes, which actually is a serious issue about continuing to spend as much as they have done now. So I think policy action by the Bank of England has led to considerably, in my view, to the situation we're in now, which of course is much better news for all of us than having a recession or just a real slowdown in the economy.
Yes, but why wouldn't the Bank of England factor in the likely response of the government and the Treasury?
Well, the Bank of England had given a number of options as to where we might end up. Some of them quite benign, particularly if we ended up with a reasonable arrangement on the trade front with the EU. But what you can't do in the forecast is really know what the pressures will be and how intense the shock might be. So the fact that the pound fell so fast and the fact that at the beginning, if you remember, share prices collapsed required immediate response of the type that nobody had actually anticipated would be required before the referendum itself. That you cannot, under any circumstance, put in your forecast.
So you still say we're doomed, Vicky?
I'm sorry?
You still say we're doomed with this Brexit?
What I'm saying is exactly what the various forecasts have said, that we are going to be growing more slowly than we would have done otherwise, that our productivity will be lower, that our deficit will be higher, and that our debt-to-GDP ratio will be higher, and we're paying for that for quite some time to come.
Well, I hope you'll come back when those predictions are either borne out or not. Thanks very much indeed, Vicky Price, the distinguished economist and former head of the Government Economic Service. News keeps coming in of another mass shooting in the United States, the 6th mass shooting in the last 6 days in that troubled land, this time at Fort Lauderdale Airport in Florida. Let's get an update with our master of the news, Toby Gillis. Toby,
I don't think I've ever been called a master of the news before, but I appreciate it.
You're my master of the news.
Well, the latest that we know is that 5 people have been killed. 8 more have been wounded after this gunman opened fire at Fort Lauderdale's International Airport in Florida. It's understood he got off a flight from Canada and then appeared to shoot at random in a baggage reclaim area. He's been arrested. He is being questioned. It's reported that he was found carrying military ID upon his arrest. And there has been a little update in the last hour or so. And this is the local sheriff, Scott Israel, speaking with reporters there.
We have the shooter in custody. He's unharmed. No law enforcement fired any shots. The subject is being interviewed by a team of FBI agents and Broward Sheriff's Office homicide detectives.
There were as well reports that there might be a second shooter. There have been videos uploaded to social media with people filming the authorities scouring the area, an underground car park in particular. But Sheriff Scott Israel, who you just heard from there, has also added that they say there is no active second shooter at this point. He says it looks like he acted alone, but he did also add that it's too soon to say whether they believe this to be a terrorist incident.
It's hard to describe it in any other way, isn't it?
Well,
what does that mean? What does that mean? He's not a Muslim. Is that what it means?
I think that might actually be the way that they see that in the States at the moment in the current climate. That was exactly what I was going to say. I suspect what that means is that they don't see this as Islamic extremism. There are reports, and I stress that they are reports, maybe even not as strong as reports, probably more like rumours, that the man who's been arrested is a 26-year-old with a Hispanic-sounding name. Now, what that might mean, who knows? And, we're generally not in the business here of reporting rumours, but to sort of, add to that point that you just made there, we don't know whether this is terrorism. Does that mean we don't know whether we can't describe this as an Islamic extremist who's carried this out? Perhaps that might answer that question.
Yeah. The definition of terrorism is, of course, becoming a vexed one. Some people are terrorists when they're operating in Europe, but described by European governments as freedom fighters when they're operating elsewhere. From what you say, it would appear that, therefore, the weapon was in the baggage.
Well, that's what I have to say was what shocked me. Presumably, he has managed to get a weapon through from Canada into the United States, unless someone somehow had planted it for him. That's the only other thing I can think of. That he's
automatically
got a contact,
means
perhaps.
He didn't act alone, of course.
Well, absolutely. But what they're saying is that there's, what I thought was interesting about that quote from the sheriff. He says there is no active second shooter. I don't know whether that means that there might be an active second person involved in some way. Incidentally, President Obama, of course, as with these things is standard, has been briefed, and President-elect Donald Trump has also said that he's monitoring the situation. What is it now? 2 weeks before President-elect becomes the president, and at the moment, what President Obama once said was one of his greatest disappointments of his time there, which was not being able to get sort of stronger checks on gun ownership, appears to be coming back to haunt him again. 6
mass shootings in 6 days can't really get much worse than that.
It's awful, isn't it? And it's something that I think most British people certainly seem to accept is as one of the most baffling parts of the law in the United States, and you see it with these statistics. 6 mass shootings in 6 days is one thing, but just the sheer number of people killed at the hands of guns every year in the United States outweighs practically every other possible type of death there can be, doesn't there? It's an extraordinary number, and I'm speaking from a personal point of view.
Yes,
now. I just don't understand.
It's interesting, though, to hear your perspective on it. The idea that the frontier spirit and all, you've got your own revolver in your holster, that's one thing. But these are powerful automatic weapons that you don't have to look somebody in the eye and have a duel with them. You just press the trigger and large numbers of people are slain. And then you change the magazine and you slay another large number. It's hard to see how that squares with living in a law-abiding, civilized society.
What I find interesting about this, and perhaps a bit of a surprise really, is that normally the outcome of these sorts of things is that the shooter gets shot. that there wasn't a single bullet fired by the authorities.
Yeah, that is amazing.
I wonder whether this
that
guy
proves he's not a Muslim. If he'd been a Muslim, he'd be lying dead now in Fort Lauderdale. Trust me on that.
It will be interesting to see what comes out of this, and he will be held, I'm sure, now indefinitely while they try and find out why he's done it. But that sort of information you would expect will come out into the public domain at some point. And,
yes, I mean that's one of them. One of America's virtues is that news doesn't stay secret for long.
No, and it will be fascinating to hear what this person's reasons for doing what he's done is, and maybe it'll be a message to those Americans who do find it difficult to think of terrorism as anything other than somebody with brown skin.
Yeah,
it might sort of teach them that it's not necessarily all Muslims that are the problem, but actually you can come from any walk of life and want to do something as particularly horrible as this. Of course, the one thing Donald Trump might have to say, if it does turn out to be somebody from a Hispanic background, is, well, let's build that wall. So
yes,
it might help him in some of his rather more strange policies.
Yeah. Toby Gillis, thanks very much indeed for that update. Toby Gillis, our master of the news, coming in to update us on the mass shooting, 6th in 6 days in the United States, in which 5 people are confirmed dead, many wounded. We don't know how seriously. The shooter under arrest, no shots fired by the law enforcement agencies. We'll keep you updated on that. Andrew Spears says economists are like pollsters, totally useless. Excuse-making, lily-livered, excuse-making, confusing carpetbaggers with noisy dogs. Oh dear, that's a bit harsh. And the lovely Marie McFarlane says Hillary didn't convince female voters. Oprah going to try the same. Proof of failure in 2016 of identity politics. My old friend Marie up there in Scotland. Andrew says Trump offered jobs and hope. Clinton war and misery and deceit. No brainer really. Right turned left, left turned right. Lol, he says correctly. Nami Dehia says, frankly, Fridays 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock are an education masterclass. Mr. George Galloway once again summarises Obama in a way no one else can do. Thank you very much for that. It pains me to say it. I was his biggest supporter. On TalkSport, I used to talk about him when he was, before he even started running for the nomination, as a likely lad, as one who was a cut above the ordinary. I shed a tear in this very building on the night that he was elected on Adrian Durham's show. A tear rolled down my face as he said, "It's been a long time coming. It was a long time coming, President Obama, but it was a terrible, terrible disappointment." Andrew says Ozzy Osbourne could run for president. Love his Birmingham accent, accepting the nomination, and him urinating against the lectern. That's actually brilliant. He's the Prince of Darkness, isn't he? Well, there's lots more in the way of tweets and emails, and lots more in the way of guests and calls. Now, it's not every day that someone comes into the studio literally hot foot with the dust of Maidenhead on his shoes from a meeting with the Prime Minister, Theresa May. And it's not every day I interview someone when I have no idea what they're going to say. But I'm about to introduce Ajit Chambers, who has just been with the Prime Minister, who has presented her a dossier, that's a discredited word now, a document which outlines his concerns, which are also mine, about how TfL in London is operating, how Uber and the Mayor's office appear to be hand in glove to the detriment of London's travellers and those black cabs that are so iconic of the London landscape. Beyond that, I don't know what Ajit is going to say. I don't know what he said to the Prime Minister, but you're about to find out at the same time as me. Ajit, welcome very much to the mother of all talk shows. Tell us, how did the meeting go with Theresa May this evening?
Hi, George. How are you?
I'm good.
Well, very interesting. Yes, I mean, we're finally there. We are finally asking for the public inquiry into Transport for London's actions across the black cab situation and Uber, the Garden Bridge project, and also the project that I spent 7 years on, the disused tube station project. So in answer to your question, very well, we went through the documentation and handed over our opinion of a solution to these situations.
Now, just sketch for listeners, especially those outside of London, of whom there are many, what are your criticisms, my criticisms, what are the general criticisms that people make of this whole TfL Uber axis?
Well, if I can start with sort of what's happening at the moment, a lot of Uber drivers are going down one-way streets, a lot of crashes happening, and really the quality has been taken away from the black cab drivers. I think a lot of people would agree with me that they are a cornerstone of London, an icon of London, much like the yellow cabs in New York. When I first came to London, I'd ask them directions, and you'd look up to them and they'd wind the window down, and then when I got old enough to pay for them and have a job, I'd then use them to get around. They know their stuff. And
they're trustworthy people because they have to pass character tests that are ongoing. You could, I'm not advocating it, but you could put your baby in a black cab and expect it to be safely delivered.
I completely agree with that sentiment, more than you know. I mean, these are chaps, and I've just come from one of their houses, as they volunteered to take me to this meeting, and he introduced me to his children and his wife and the house, and they're not just trustworthy as a falsity. They really are these characters. They really are the real London.
I agree with that. Now, tell us about the Garden Bridge. This is something I've been suspicious of for a very long time. Tell people what the Garden Bridge is and why there are causes for concern about it.
Well, George, I'll always speak frankly to you, and especially on your show. The Garden Bridge was a project that was to build a bridge across London that had some guidelines. Now, if you look back in history, a number of bridges were supposed to be built or authorised to be built across London to get people across them because of the volume. But it was stopped a long time ago. The procurement process for the Garden Bridge has been incredibly interesting, run by a certain number of people within TfL and the last mayor's office. And it turns out that the GLA report has come out, and it states specifically that the bidders for the Garden Bridge should be recompensed for the time they've put in, because the chances of them winning were almost zero after the essential original plan changed during the procurement process. If I can quote someone, and I won't say the exact name, but I think the mayor's office at the time said, "We have lost the paperwork." Now, I have a dog, but my dog doesn't eat the paperwork for my business.
No, and the close relationship, let's put it that way, between the person who came up with the idea of the Garden Bridge and the mayor was well attested to. They took a trip together to the United States, which wasn't properly accounted for by the former mayor, Boris Johnson. His diary did not contain the information that he was in the United States. It simply said he would be away. Still less that he would be in the United States with one of the bidders.
Completely correct. And I know this very closely because I used to work in financing between Switzerland and London, and I was tracing different mayors around the world and where their flights went to in order to start the new business opening the disused tube stations. So I actually mailed the mayor of New York during that time, and these discrepancies have led to a problem which I encountered as well, which is the lack of minute taking, or that the minutes have been lost after such meetings.
The dog ate the homework. Tell us about your proposal for the unused tube stations.
Well, I smile and I'm quite excited to tell you about this, but in 2009 I found an old map in a shop, which actually turned out to be under TfL's headquarters, I found out later on. The map detailed 26 disused tube stations. I went home and my wife came back to find me handwriting on my apartment walls, and I designed a business plan to make £200 million worth of jobs and contracts for London by making tourist adventures and other businesses use these old tube stations.
Where are they? Give me some indication of where they are.
Well, the one that we've been working on for a while is Down Street, 300 metres west of Green Park Station. There's the Old Witch on the Strand that I've just driven past. There are three...
They're both ideally placed for the tourism market, aren't they?
Fabulously placed, in fact, yes.
And you want to renovate them? You want to open them up for different kinds of adventures? Tell us about that.
Well, I call it the Indiana Jones experience.
Yeah.
You essentially take your family, and instead of travelling far out of town very expensively, having to take the day off, etc., you can walk your children and your partner out of a tube station like Green Park, go 300 metres, and then you open a door. You do a 40-metre drop into an old tube station that hasn't been seen in many, many years. And down in there you'll find different rooms, kitchens. Churchill's bathtub and apartment was down there. And I call it the Indiana Jones experience because when you come out, you look around London in a different way. You realise there's actually a whole world that used to exist down there as well.
Fantastic. I'd be a customer for you on that, I promise you. Lastly, what about the Uber situation? This is something that has occupied me greatly. The Uber drivers have won some important victories in the courts recently, which establish that effectively they are slave labour. Some of them are doing okay if they work 80, 90 hours a week, but they have no facilities, no training. Anyone can become an Uber driver. They don't have to know London. They don't have to speak English. They don't have to be of good character, and let's put it no more sharply than this, some of them have turned out not to be. And yet, and the company says it isn't a transport company, says it's just an app, and yet this multi-billion-dollar enterprise has appeared to carry all before it in relation to London transport policy, and many of us are suspicious as to the reasons for that.
Well, that was brilliantly put. I'm going to start a little bit further back and link into that. At the moment, I'm battling Transport for London, as they've managed to sell 17,000 tickets using my business plan to open the disused tube stations. We found the individuals involved in this are also the individuals involved in the Garden Bridge procurement problem that happened. Surprisingly, these are the same individuals involved in bringing Uber to town, and this is where it gets very interesting. I'll agree with you completely that the Uber situation is very dangerous and life-threatening at the moment. The way that it has been brought into London is under huge discrepancy. The sentiment that you had just then about the drivers being untrained is really the core and key of this, which are Londoners are dying because of this decision, and they're being run over and hit, taken away, and not dropped in the right place. I actually wanted to come on your show, George, because I want to challenge the Transport Commissioner to a conversation with me about how he allowed Uber to come to town and threaten the lives of Londoners.
Well, that's a challenge well made, and I'll echo it and offer the hospitality of this studio in order to have it. And I'm sure that our social media people will put that challenge out. The the nexus that you describe is, for me, I'm saying this, quite a shady one. It's certainly not transparent. Nobody in London can quite understand how, never mind why, how all of this came to pass, and we deserve to. So let's close on your call for a public inquiry. Into what do you want a public inquiry, and what did Mrs. May say when you asked her for one?
Well, one of the things about meeting the Prime Minister is that you would keep the exact details a little bit quiet. But I can say this, and if you imagine her eyebrow raised when we started talking, especially about the Garden Bridge, especially about Uber, and most especially about my disused tube station project. Where we are at the moment is that the leader of our country has been informed that a public inquiry into Transport for London has been requested formally. We're now waiting for that response. We would like to be part of the public inquiry. And if I could say, one of the biggest breakthroughs that I'm really pleased to tell you about is the black cab organisations are finally getting together to...
Well, hallelujah, that's an achievement.
It is.
You did better than me in that regard.
I learned a little bit from you, if I'm honest.
Well, look, it's been fascinating talking with you about this. I don't think it's the last time we're going to meet, either in this studio or elsewhere. If there's anything I can do to help, in the course of last year, I developed a lot of arguments about how TfL could be expressed in more ways than just Transport for London, and some of them too pejorative to say on the radio. I'm not an expert on the Garden Bridge, but I've always smelt a rat about it, and I'm smelling a rat about your tube station project too. So the best of luck with your call for a public inquiry, and promise you'll come back to keep us abreast of what's happening, won't you?
Thank you so much for the time, George, and I'll definitely do the comeback as soon as we have that answer.
Thanks very much. That's Ajit Chambers, a man who has united the black cab trade, and that's no easy matter, I may tell you. And he's been to see the Prime Minister, no less, which isn't easy to do. And he's presented her with a demand for a public inquiry. And here on Talk Radio, he has challenged the Transport Commissioner to a public conversation about all these matters. Thank you again, Ajit Chambers. Let me first read at least one or two of a series of tweets from Andrew Spears, who says of my last guest, "This guy is a joke, a proper toff, being condescending to people who need cheap transport." Well, how cheap would it be, Andrew, this cheap transport, if your driver drove up a one-way street the wrong way, if your driver crashed the car, if your driver turned out not to have the proper insurance? How cheap would it be, Andrew, if the driver physically or even sexually assaulted your wife or your daughter? How cheap would it be if the driver turned out to be a crook? You see, cheap is not necessarily cheap. Cheap when it's the product of willful, systematic deregulation, stripping away all the protections that our people have and have had in the public transport system, when we had tubes and trains that had enough staff on it to come to the aid of people in distress, to help your old mother on and off the train, a cab driver who had to meet a good character test, who was regularly subjected to the most rigorous Ministry of Transport checks and regulation, a driver who had to know every street in London, a driver who had to know the best way to get you to your destination, a driver that you could trust. That's more expensive, Andrew, but it's cheaper in the long run, as many, many, many Uber passengers have already found. You see, The right wing knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The value of drivers you can trust, who know London, who are London, is not to be sniffed at for the sake of a few pounds saved, if you're lucky, on an Uber transport ride. And if you're unlucky, you end up in the accident and emergency if it's not been closed by the very same politicians who brought you Uber. Uber, for me, is the personification of red in tooth and claw free market capitalism, with no regulation, no standards. Standards, Andrew, is what I'm talking about here. And it is the deregulation of our lives, the scrapping of standards, the melting of all that was solid into air, the profaning of all that was sacred. That is what is wrong with this country. Uber is a $50 billion idea, born of the most rapacious buccaneering capitalism. It doesn't even exist as a transport company. It has no office. It has no telephone. It claims to be merely the producer of an app based in Amsterdam, where coincidentally it pays virtually no tax. And it has been allowed to spread like a virus across London and other cities too. So, Andrew, I'm tiring of your endless cascade of missing the point. Sean Caden says, I'm 100% behind the black cab driver. Uber Muppets on sat-navs in London doesn't cut it. Save the taxi, says Sean. Now here's some breaking news. Russian President Vladimir Putin sought to help Donald Trump win the presidential election, a U.S. intelligence report says. The declassified report says the Russian leader, quote, ordered, unquote, a campaign aimed at influencing the election. The report was released shortly after intelligence chiefs briefed Mr. Trump on their findings. Mr. Trump stopped short of accusing Russia of interfering, saying only that the election outcome was not affected. This broke in the last 15 minutes, so I wanted a Russian response, not an official one, but a man who knows the inside of the Kremlin and of Russian politics very well. Alexander Nekrasov, a very fine talker on the radio. He was on talkRADIO earlier. I apologize for bringing you back so soon, Alexander, but we needed a response to these charges.
No problem, George. Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Okay, you've read a bit of that new. It's this non-confidential part of a wider report, as I understand,
yes,
which has been prepared, and I think they've briefed Trump on it today,
yes,
all these directors. And what can I say? Well, first of all, it's not a crime, actually, to wish for somebody to win in any country, you know?
The U.S. has been doing it for half a century at least, Alexander.
No, but in this case, what they're saying is that, I don't know whether you've heard about it, but they are claiming that they got recorded a conversation by some Russian official who said, well, it's a good thing that Trump has won, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what does it say? No, I mean, on this basis, they're sort of developing it and saying, well, that means the Russians wanted Trump to win, and that is why we think they've meddled in our political process and helped him to win, and so on, which is bizarre, which is absolutely idiotic, because there is no proof, there are no names, no dates, no anything. They're just saying, we think this happened. And this is quite strange. You know, what I find really bizarre is that the heads of the intelligence community, you know, of these intelligent agencies, are basically playing politics rather than doing their job. So what has obviously happened is that Obama and the Democrats are very upset they've lost. So they are not very good losers, are they? So they've decided to find somebody to blame for their loss. So they found the Russians. And it looks very, very strange to anyone who knows how, the system works, how things work in the real world. So what they're saying is that Putin gathered all his people, probably in the Kremlin, and said to them, guys, we need Trump to win. So do whatever you can and help him to win. That's how they present it. That doesn't work like this in the real world. Presidents don't do things like that. It's a very strange, impression that people have, that Putin is sort of getting together his intelligence services and his military and saying, guys, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to go there, and so on. This is not done like that. Doesn't work like this in the real world.
Well, they've stopped short of saying he had a big furry white cat on his lap, which he stroked when he gave these.
He's a dog lover. You see, George, he likes dogs, not cats.
Okay.
So
they've stopped short of that. But this is now morphed, Alexander. First it was Russians, then it was the Russians, and now it is the president of Russia who ordered this operation to be carried out. These are very grave and serious allegations to make against the president of another state, another superpower.
Well, first of all, George, let me remind you that not so long ago we had a NSA scandal, right? The spying scandal.
Yes.
And we learned that the NSA, along with other intelligence agencies, had been spying on what? Practically every country in the world.
Including Angela Merkel's personal phone.
Yes, and by the way, Prime Minister Medvedev's phone, this phone, that phone, on everyone, right? The numbers of people who were eavesdropped and hacked, their phones hacked into, and computers were in hundreds of thousands of people, right, across the whole world. Now this happened not long ago, right? Mm-hmm. So the same people who were sitting yesterday at those congressional hearings and accusing Russia of this massive hacking operation and influencing the American presidential elections, these same people were involved in that massive spying operation across the whole world. And they had the nerve to say that it's Russia, you see, it's Russia that is the culprit. You see, they have been spying on everyone, but it was Russia. After all these, sort of years, I think they even mentioned that Russia was doing it, I think since the 1960s. That it was influencing the political life in the United States, which makes Russia, and then obviously Soviet Union, and currently Putin, so powerful, so influential that, we are starting to believe that he can probably change presidents anywhere, in any country.
It is an extraordinary self-degrading performance, I think, this week in the congressional hearings. But let's look at the wider picture. Nobody has said that a single word of the WikiLeaks publication was untrue. So what we're being asked to be aghast about is that Russia may have provided entirely true information to WikiLeaks, which WikiLeaks, I may say, completely deny. And that WikiLeaks put out those cables, that information, which none of the mainstream media in the United States broadcast or published. So the number of people who ever saw or heard what WikiLeaks was saying as a result of a leak or a hack is infinitesimally small compared to the American electorate. This is a coup, is it not? It's an attempt to make a coup against Trump precisely because Trump has declared that he wants good relations with Russia rather than bad. And all these people have a vested interest in the continuation of bad relations with Russia.
Well, first of all, I would love to be present at that meeting which Trump had today with the chiefs, with the heads of intelligence agencies, American intelligence agencies, who were briefing him on their own report into Russian hacking, right? Mm-hmm. So what they were basically saying to Mr. Trump is that, Mr. President-elect, the thing is that you didn't really win the election. You were helped by the Russians to win the elections. And this is what we are telling you. This is so remarkable and so absurd because these people, these heads of intelligence agencies, they are basically involved in a soft coup against the president-elect because they are trying to tell him that he didn't win fair and square, that he only won because the Russians were on his side and they influenced the election campaign. This is absurd, and you're quite right. Nobody's sort of asking a very simple question. Well, if all of these leaked emails are correct, and they contain damaging information, which implies that the Democrats were cheating, lying, waging hate campaigns against each other and other people, and it's all true because nobody was denying it, then, excuse me, probably the question should be, why are not the Democrats punished for what they've done? Why is not Hillary Clinton is brought to account for what she's done and her people? Why is that they are looking for someone to blame on, sort of to blame the messenger? It is absolutely unbelievable that America in the 21st century is basically showing signs of, I don't know, a meltdown. Is it a meltdown?
It's a kind of meltdown. Last question, Alexander. Neither of us can answer this definitively, but I've seen Trump's statement after his meeting with the spy chiefs today. That's what we should call them. They're not a community, which is a piece of soft soap that has crept into the discourse in the last couple of days. The spy chiefs, I've seen his response. It doesn't look like a back down to me. What's your feeling? Will Trump be? Will he allow them to cut him off at the knees in this way?
Well, I think that Trump is playing cool because he needs to wait till the 20th. He needs to be sworn in. So what he's going to do after that is difficult to say. He will replace some of the spy chiefs, as you call them. That's probably right, the right description. I call them a circus, to be honest with you, because it smacks of a circus rather than of a community or spy chiefs. But anyway, I think he's waiting for that day when he's sworn in, when his people will be appointed. I think the military are on his side, and I think that is something that stops some of the hotheads from doing something really, really stupid. But I think that some of these chiefs will have to step down. To be honest with you, I think what they've done is not just politicizing the intelligence services. I think they have stepped over the line. Honestly, they're military people in a sense, so they need to understand there will be consequences of what they've done.
Alexander Nekrasov, thank you very much for joining us at this late hour and illuminating the statement by the spy chiefs in the US that Vladimir Putin ordered the Russian security services to bring about the victory of Donald Trump as the American president. Let's hear from Bella in London. Go ahead, Bella.
Hello, George. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. I was really interested in hearing what Mr. Chambers was talking about earlier regarding further scrutiny of transport for London.
Yes.
And how he'd had a meeting with Mrs. May. Basically, I'm a supporter of the Save Earls Court campaign here in London.
Oh, yes, me too. Yes.
Know about.
I'm a big supporter too.
Exactly. Thanks, George. And basically, I think that the scrutiny which he mentioned regarding Uber and disused train tube stations and the Garden Bridge, I think an inquiry and scrutiny should go on to the Earls Court Master Plan, because Transport for London have gone into a development project, the Earls Court Master Plan, which has demolished, as you know, the iconic exhibition centre. It threatens 22 acres of decent social housing on the West Ken and Gibbs Green estates, and is going to move the manufacturing depot, Lily Bridge depot, which is also a safety depot. And there's concerns there about job losses. So I think that this is opening a can of worms potentially for Mrs. May. You know, when you look at what's been going on in these various issues regarding TfL. And
well, she has nothing to lose, Bella, in opening that can of worms. After all, it's now presided over by a Labour mayor, nominally at least, Sadiq Khan, and it was presided over by Boris Johnson, her erstwhile rival. So actually, she'd be well advised to have a public inquiry into TfL for those reasons and the reasons we've been talking about tonight, including the Earls Court scandal. And I believe it is a scandal.
It is a scandal, and actually what you've just said is reassuring, George. I hadn't thought about it from that angle. And as you look into the Earls Court Master Plan, there have been serious questions asked about the viability study which Capco, the developer, undertook. Now, Sadiq Khan, the current mayor, he's setting up a team, or has set up a team, to look into these viability studies. But Sean Berry, the Green London Assembly member, she tweeted recently that there's only going to be 2 people in this team. And that's not enough, because it's not just the projects that are coming on stream, it's the projects that have gone before, where there's some serious questions about the complete lack of genuinely affordable housing. So I've been very disappointed, to be honest, so far with Mr. Khan as mayor when it comes to the Earls Court Master Plan. Because I remember, George, when you stood for mayor, you said you'd review the master plan if you became mayor.
Yep.
And Sadiq Khan, there was a petition signed by 7,000 people asking him to review the master plan. He's got into power, and he's been saying he can't review the master plan. It was decisions made under the previous mayor, and it's only if a fresh planning application comes forward that he will look at things again.
His promises weren't worth the paper they weren't written on. Bella, thanks for bringing that to our attention. My advice to you is to contact Mr. Chambers and to encourage him to add the Earls Court scandal into the mix. And he'd be well advised to do so. And my hat's off to you and your fellow campaigners. Thanks very much for the call. Now, I did deal, perhaps roughly, with Andrew Spears' tweets earlier. It's only fair I give him the right of reply. And so he's up next. Andrew Spears in Burton upon Trent. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi there, George. You all right?
Yes, good, mate.
Yeah, good. Well, first of all, I need to say that I didn't quite understand the nuances of the way you described Uber and the way it's allowed to practice like that. I was coming at it from the point of, I still honestly believe there should be alternative options other than black.
But there are, Andrew. There are licensed minicabs.
Right, yeah.
And that system of black cabs and licensed minicabs has worked well in London for years. Now the streets are absolutely chock full of anybody who fancies it becoming a cab driver and calling himself an Uber driver. And they're causing accidents on every road, every night in London.
But who's allowing them to do this, George? How's it going
Boris Johnson.
Right, so...
And untouched by Sadiq Khan. Yeah, that's why we need a public inquiry. Because the public inquiry is into Boris Johnson and Sadiq Khan. And in particular, Boris Johnson, who sat at the top of what I believe, this is my own personal view, it's not talk radios, was a corrupt relationship between the mayor's office and Uber. I believe that, and I believe a public inquiry would show that.
Definitely. And now I'm beginning to understand it more. I obviously can start to focus like a more ideal way of who to actually look at, who causes this, because people deserve options. People really do deserve options.
Yeah, of course they do.
And I was coming at it naively, although going to London a lot, not really using that, but feeling that people deserved those options. But obviously you've put me right, and I just thought I'd come on the phone and explain my reasoning behind what I actually
Okay, Andrew, very good of you, big of you to do so. I appreciate the call.
Thank you, George.
You've still got a few minutes to ring me. My blood's up. I'm ready to take more. Rob from Glasgow emails, there's one easy fix for the problems that we all face around the world. Abolish privately owned central banks. How can anyone hope to settle debts with currency that is issued as debt itself? It's the biggest scam ever perpetrated on people the world over. That's from Rob in Glasgow, a very clever email. Salman Khan says many have tried to unite Europe, whether economic or political. They all failed. The Romans, Napoleon, and even Hitler. And Marie says Marcus Aurelius quote, surely not opinion that people starve. Is it not fact that the Roman Empire declined and fell? It's a fair point, Marie, but I think the point that's being made is that there are few actual cast iron facts in the world. Everything is a point of view. You see, you could say, as the intelligence chiefs, the nest of spies that visited Trump today, have a right to be angry about Russia having a point of view on who should be the president of the United States. My perspective is the opposite. It is this, that Russia would be fools if they did not have a preference as to who should be the president of the United States, given that one candidate was running on a platform of good relations with them, and the other candidate was running on a platform of war with them. They'd be idiots not to have a point of view. Secondly, the United States has intervened, interfered, subverted, invaded, occupied, and all-round trashed 50 countries since the Second World War. And they are the last people on the earth with a right to be offended that anybody from outside, as it happens, the outsider was Julian Assange, holed up in a room in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, nothing to do with Vladimir Putin. This was a leak, not a hack, and it was a leak from a member of the Democratic Party itself. I happen to know that. I couldn't tell you how, or I'd have to kill you. Declan Gillespie says, any comments on the RHI scandal and Arlene Foster in the north of Ireland? Well, I don't have any comments on it, Declan, because I don't know enough about it. But enough people have been talking about it on my Twitter and my emails that I think it's about time we turned to it. So maybe if Ed, my maestro through the glass, can make a note that next week we want to deal with this RHI scandal, which has called into question not just the leadership in the north of Ireland of Arlene Foster, but threatens an early election and the potential collapse of the power-sharing government there. It's a murky scandal involving a lot of money, and it is dividing the population on new lines. You see, most things are able to be divided in the north of Ireland on sectarian lines, but this one not. This is about either negligence and incompetence or worse. And that cuts across sectarian divisions in Ireland, in the north, because everybody, whatever their sectarian background, whatever their religion, has an interest in clean government, competent government in the north of Ireland. So, Declan, I promise you we'll deal with it next week. Hedy says, I thank the EU. 3 beautiful young Italians live in my house and work hard in the UK since the Brusselsocrats ruined Italy's economy. It's a bit contradictory, that, Hedy. It was the EU that ruined Italy's economy, and Greece's economy, and Spain's economy, and Portugal's economy. And yet you thank them because 3 beautiful young Italians live in your house. All of us would be happy to have 3 beautiful young Italians living in their house. And there's no reason at all why, once we've left the EU, that any beautiful Italians currently living here cannot stay. It's certainly my policy that they must be allowed to stay. Equally, they'd be fully entitled to apply for work permits to come and work here in the very same way that an Australian has to, or an American has to, or as we have to in their countries. Nobody's locking up the doors, pulling up the drawbridge. We just don't want to be ruled by people we didn't elect and cannot remove. What's so hard to understand about that? We want to be a sovereign, independent country that can decide which beautiful young Italians can come and live and work here and which cannot. Whether we need those 3 beautiful young Italians, not the ones who are already here, they'd be staying here, but 3 new beautiful young Italians, whether we need them to fill jobs that aren't being filled with British workers. We've got an existential crisis here in the British working class. Everywhere I go, even in Glencoe, in a small hotel in the Scottish Highlands, this last week, even in Glencoe, all the workers in the hotel were foreign workers. Now, they were great, and I loved them. They were your equivalent of the 3 beautiful young Italians. But everywhere I go, especially early in the morning, all the workers that are going to work are speaking to each other in European languages. Where are our workers? Are they at home? Are they still in bed? Some of them are, by the way. Some of them have grown out of the habit of doing the jobs that other people are now doing for them, and as a consequence, driving down wages and putting pressure on services that makes every matter worse for every worker in Britain, wherever they came from, whatever colour they are, however they pray. So when I say that one of the reasons why I wanted to leave the European Union was so that we could get our own people back to work, I mean even those of our own people who have fallen out of the habit of working, or who won't work for the wages that the foreign workers are working for. I want Britain to be an independent manufacturing state again. I want it to be trading with the whole world, not just with our former partners in the European Union. And I want a government that is free to take the necessary action to put our country back to work and to make us a manufacturing power again, because we don't have that power so long as we remain in the European Union. Let me take another couple of tweets. Marie says, there's no such thing as institutions being benign. Central bankers knew what would happen if we were leaving the EU. They flapped. And a texter says, George, it's truly magic when innocent people are slain in incidents of this kind. It's truly tragic when innocent people are slain in incidents of this kind. But what can we really expect when guns in the US are so plentiful, and almost every film that Hollywood churns out is yet another blow 'em up, shoot 'em up, war and violence piece of garbage? A very good point on which to end on a very sombre evening when the 6th mass shooting in 6 days took place in the United States of America. Next week, I'll give more of a retrospective on the disappointment of Barack Obama. It's been marvellous for me. If it was for you, join me again.